This next topic that I want to talk about this evening is the situation with domestic violence. This is a very pernicious, widespread problem around the country. It's very difficult for criminal justice, law enforcement, the courts, everybody involved. A real interesting study on this was done actually up in Minnesota by the police department. And I wanted to share a little bit about that with you, and then also talk a little bit about some of my own personal experiences in this. And you can actually find this. It's called the Minneapolis Domestic Violence Experiment. It was first done in April 1984. There was a grant from the National Institute of Justice. And so the Minneapolis police cooperated, sometimes rather grudgingly on an individual basis. A number of police, for example, didn't really want to be involved in it because it required them to take these researchers out in the field with them in their cars. The researchers would witness what went on in these different houses, the decision-making process. So a lot of it was observational in terms of the type of research. And one of the problems that came up is there was a variety of different techniques in dealing with domestic violence problems. But that was really what was interesting about this study, because there were a number of women's groups that were complaining that they didn't feel that whatever police were doing was effective in domestic violence type situations. And so there were several different possible outcomes for a domestic violence report by a police officer. Some examples were the people were warned and released. In other words, the police officers came, checked the situation out, told everybody they needed to quiet down, and then the police officers left. Another option was that they told the man that he had to engage in a cooling off period. So they stood there and watched him while he left the house. He had to pack up a few things and take off in his car. But then the police officers left, and who knows if the guy came back or stayed away or, followed their advice or whatever. Another thing that was interesting in this, that seems like the most effective thing that was done in the study, is that an arrest was made of whoever they deemed to be the perpetrator in the case. Some of the basic problems with domestic violence is generally a misdemeanor battery is what you're talking about here in domestic violence. And in all misdemeanors, the tradition, common law tradition, was if the police officer didn't witness the crime, then he could not make an arrest. So some new laws that change the whole way that we think about domestic violence have been passed, which do not require the police officer to observe actual battery. They can observe instead the results of the battery. So if the wife has a black eye, the guy's there, he's kind of drunk, he's obnoxious, he's very belligerent, then they are by rights able under this new statute to take the husband into custody and arrest him for domestic battery, which is a different kind of battery. Now another thing is that again, to the extent that how much damage is done to the person in a domestic battery can involve possibly felony charges depending on the seriousness of the injuries and the repetitive nature of these domestic violence reports. What's been found is that there's certain people that engage in domestic violence, they get on a terrible cycle of domestic violence, so it's a constant repeated thing. And so basically it's very, very problematic. It comes up over and over again. One of the most frustrating things that I learned when I was working in this field was that the police would bring the person in that was arrested, like let's say the boyfriend or the husband, and before they could even get all the paperwork done, here was the wife, girlfriend, whoever, and her mother or her aunt or somebody with cash coming in there trying to bond the guy out before they were even able to process the paperwork. And so basically the women would say, well, I really need him to be out because he's got to go to work. He's got to feed the kids. And a lot of times the reasons for domestic violence do revolve around a lack of money, can't pay the bills, don't take care of the family like they should. And this is kind of emasculating for a man, and so men can get frustrated, drink too much, resort to violence. So it's a constant cycle of violence that goes around and around and around. One of the other things on this is that children that witness this violence sometimes become violent themselves, become frustrated, have low self-image. Sometimes they feel guilty, like, oh, it's my fault that my parents fight. And so it can have a poor effect on their upbringing. And sometimes the worst possible outcome is that the child actually turns to crime themselves out of a sense of frustration and anger based upon the violence that's being done to them or to their mother. So basically there were 3 different treatments that were given, if you want to call them treatments, by the police when they would report a domestic violence call that they answered. There would be an arrest, would be one possibility. So in the study, they studied a number of these different arrests. There was also advice, which once again they'd say quiet down, leave each other alone, cool off, and just stay that way. Other type of option was separation, where they would literally physically tell the man he had to leave the house, he could not come back. And so basically what we ended up with is a series of different cases, and like I said, out of those 3 different outcomes in this study in Minneapolis, which is done by Sherman in 1984, the actual outcome that was most helpful, that stopped violence, was the arrest. In other words, you put the perpetrator in jail and let them sit there for a good long period of time, maybe at least 4 to 8 hours, and then they could possibly bond out. But that apparently first time actually taught some of them a lesson at least. Now there are some chronic cases that no matter how many cases that you had, you did not, see success, and it just kept coming up and up and up. And you'll see that in some of these smaller courts where we have people who constantly are getting into trouble of some kind. You just see them over and over and over again. Same way in this domestic violence cycle. Some other interesting facts from this Minnesota study was unemployment plays a big role in this. That plays a big role. Victims in a child abuse or, domestic violence case, 60% of suspects were unemployed, 61% of victims were unemployed. So this lack of income plays a big part in causing domestic violence. Financial issues are often at the heart of it. Also, different relationships. Of all cases, the absolute most prominent in domestic violence is unmarried male lover. So you have a live-in or a boyfriend resorts to violence, and you get trapped in this and you can't get out as a victim. 45% of all cases involved more of a boyfriend type relationship. 35% of all cases involved a husband. So the 45% was a boyfriend, 35% the husband. So that right there is 80% of all cases are those 2 types. Another type is son, brother, roommates, a small group, divorced parent, divorced husband, 3%, very small time. In other words, usually they're gone from the scene, you don't see them again. Others are just like roommates, 15%. So that pretty much takes you up to 95%. So sometimes they claim they don't have any kind of relationship, they're just sharing rent, but still 15% of them get into some type of domestic violence. Interesting that victims, generally speaking, in these domestic violence cases had been previously battered in a domestic violence case, domestic battery. In 80% of the cases, within the last 6 months, the victims had already often been a victim in another case. So we have a case, well, there was a previous case in the last 6 months. Also, domestic disputes where it didn't rise to the actual level of violence, 60% of them had a prior instance of some kind of a report to the police. Another group, 27% out of the cases, were in some kind of counseling for problems in their relationship. A lot of different men that are involved in this have been arrested for other offenses. 60% of all men in a domestic violence case have prior arrests. 31% are against totally other people. Could be any kind of thing, theft or anything like that. 59% something else, maybe drugs or public intoxication, DWI, things like that. Others, a third have had prior arrests for some kind of drinking or drinking too much. And so alcohol, substance abuse, very prominently involved in a lot of domestic violence cases. Frustration over money and abuse of alcohol and drugs are two of the main reasons why we have these domestic violence cases. Well, of most of the cases, the victims, 43% have no high school diploma. 42% of the suspects have no diploma from high school, have no high school education. 57% of all domestic violent cases are performed by whites, while 45% the suspects are white. So 57% of victims are white, 45% of suspects are white. On the other hand, blacks, 23% of all victims are black, and 36% of all suspects are black. There's other groups that are prominent in this study too. Native Americans, for example, high category of substance abuse and domestic violence. 18% of all victims Native American, 16% of all suspects Native American. So basically you can see that there are a number of different things that report here. Bottom line though, of all these different outcomes, 24% are repeat violence over a 6-month period. And so very important to consider that this is a repetitive kind of a thing. Another thing is that, as we said, the most successful outcome is just to arrest the guy, take him to jail, and have him sit for a good long period of time. Of the cases where there was prior involvement, very few of them had actually resulted in an arrest. Only about 20% of ones where a woman has been battered in the last 6 months had involved an arrest. So what the point of this study is, if you step up the number of arrests, then you have better success in the future of reducing the number of cases in the future. So in other words, what they're saying is you just got to get tough on any kind of domestic violence where people are harmed, victims harmed, victim shows evidence of a black eye, for example, and so you know what they're saying is something's got to give as far as cracking down. Hold them in jail for at least a short period of time, and then you seem to have better success. Well, Lawrence Sherman was the main author in this. He was also helped by Richard Burke. Lawrence Sherman from University of Maryland. Richard Burke is from University of California at Santa Barbara. So this is a classic study, very interesting, that there are many of these cases, that the issue mainly with the cases is that this happens over and over again, and it's difficult to find an answer other than just to say, hey, you're going to have to sit in jail for a while. That kind of runs counter to the direction that we're kind of trying to go, is to try to reduce the number of people that are in jail. But at least in this study, we're looking at a number of these type situations where this is unfortunately what has to happen. So hey, I hope that you enjoyed viewing this, and if you have any questions, you can always feel free to get a hold of me. Information is in the syllabus, and so basically check back with me at any time. and I'll be glad to answer any questions you have, or as we've said many times before, you can view this over and over again. And so basically what we're looking at here is the end of Module 7. I hope it's been helpful. We're getting close to the end here. We'll move on to another difficult topic, and then we'll be finished with the course. So appreciate your involvement. Thank you very much.